Good evening, good morning for some of you, good afternoons for the others. Welcome to the third Global Leadership Masterclass curated by the Open Diplomacy Institute in 2022 with the support of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Canadian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and NG. We are very happy to host you today to discuss another topic we wanted to address this year, which is the infrastructure geopolitics. And therefore we will have the great pleasure to have a round of discussion with Dr. Mihai PRECUP, who is Romania's Secretary of State for Finance, and many other prominent guests, which I will introduce in the course of our discussion, from Kenya, from Japan, from Italy, and from the US. This masterclass is meant for us to draw lessons from what leadership means in facing complex issues, just like we did in addressing digital disruptions next week. That's the other topics we had already was to close the gender gap. And this topic today is meant to address a very sensitive aspect of international relations, which is infrastructure building as ties last. And we all have heard about the competition between global powers in building infrastructure, China's Belt and Road Initiative, the European Union Global Gateway response, as well as the prior to that US initiative around the Washington Consensus. And to address this issue, I'm very happy to bring into the conversation Dr. Mihai PRECUP, who is today the Secretary of State for Finance in Romania. We'll have a quarter of discussion, and after that, we will have a wider public policy discussion with the rest of our panelists. And I encourage you to use the chat in asking questions so that we can incorporate your queries into the debates before we get to the Q&A session at the end of this masterclass. Welcome to Dr. Mihai PRECUP, that I'm happy to introduce to you today. Hi, Mihai. I hope you can. Yeah,
yes,
it's
I
all
can
right.
hear you very well. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Always a pleasure to be around Open Diplomacy. It is a great pleasure for me to send some messages, let's say, from the Romanian government on this very important topic, developing infrastructure in these difficult times, particularly Romania, due to the geographical position. It's a little bit, it's near the war, so the war is at our border. Very challenging for us. It makes us believe that now is the moment more than ever to develop infrastructure. For us, the war was, and these difficult moments provided also good opportunities, even that we face.
And in stating so, you clearly outline why we wanted to have you from Romania to talk about this topic. Let me ask you this first question about your role in the Ministry of Finance of Romania. You, as a Secretary of State for Finance, you are in charge specifically of relationships with the international financial institutions. And this is key to accelerate the development of the infrastructures of your country. And I would like to know which international organizations you work with and why, and how it can help to boost Romania's development, what type of infrastructures you aim at developing with this type of cooperation, and why it could be critical for your country's path.
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting question. So first of all, I said that even though we have a war at our border, there are huge opportunities in developing infrastructure. Now the request from the companies to host, for instance, in in Constanța port, it's more than never. I mean, we need to develop all this infrastructure, and we see that also inflation is due to the lack of investments all over Europe. And we are looking to develop also transport infrastructure as well as energy infrastructure in order to be more independent of from Russian imports. Anyway, Romania, I think, is one of the most independent countries in terms of imports of raw materials from Russia in Europe and for sure in Eastern Europe. In my responsibilities, I have the relation with the IFIs, international financial institutions. Myself, I used to work for one of them, for the European Investment Bank, for a couple of years. I'm in charge with all the European, EBRD, EIB, and also IMF and the World Bank, all the IFIs which are in contact with Romania. I think we are now developing a strategy with them to set up PPPs, public partnerships, public-private partnerships in order to develop infrastructure. Romania is very active also in the relation with EIB, which is one of the world's biggest financiers in terms of infrastructure. And we are benefiting from them as well as financing, but also technical assistance in setting up projects and in developing projects. Another responsibility in my portfolio is the management of state participation in the financial institutions. We have in Romania 2 banks which are systemic banks for Romania, which are owned by the state, and they are under the management of my office. Also guarantee funds, and we are very much working now to develop to set up a Romanian development bank. You have in France BPI France, you have KfW in Germany, and we are looking to learn from their expertise and develop a set up a national development bank. We really believe that the partnership with the financial institution is key, but you need a local footprint in order to identify strategic projects for the country and channel the funds from the IFIs towards the specific projects in Romania. We believe that the IFIs can provide long-term financing cheaper than the Romanian state can find now on the financial markets, less volatile the cost of the financing, as well as long-term financing, which is rarely the case on the financial markets. And on top of this, the financial institutions can provide technical assistance, very important in preparing the projects, because we live in a world in Europe as well as in Romania where the liquidity is abundant. You benefit of a lot of liquidity, but the challenge is to prepare sound project in order to be bankable and to be very interesting for the financial institutions as well as for the private sector.
Yeah, we will definitely zoom on this PPP approach that you touched upon, and also about I'm about to ask you a question about this idea of a national development bank, but I'm just outlining how much important it is for you to have access to cheaper long-term financing and also technical expertise in working with international financial institutions, which are at the regional and global level. But as you just said, your development strategy also relies on investments in infrastructures, which could be channeled through a national development bank for Romania. What we usually have when we hear development bank is foreign aid, and in France it echoes more Agence Française de Développement than BPI, the Banque Publique d'Investissement, Bank for Public Investments. But we clearly got the idea that it's a public investment bank that you're working on. Why is it so critical to have a tool like this to sustain your strategy of investment and to boost your growth with high standard and resilient infrastructure that you need to meet your targets?
First of all, as you very well know, the infrastructure projects are long-term projects. It takes a time to set up, it takes a time to implement, and it's a very long time to operate this type of projects. A national development bank would play a very important role in terms of stability. As you know, in any European countries, you'll always have a certain volatility in terms of politics. in terms of prime ministers, in terms of ministers. The role of a development bank is to have a more steady approach and better prioritize the project and have a long-term follow-up on the infrastructure projects. This is the first point. Second point, a national development bank will always, we believe that will always know better the realities at the local level than an IFI, international financial institution. Thirdly, as we said, there are a lot of liquidities on the market. The main challenge is to manage to channel all this liquidity from the IFIs towards the Romanian economy. And better is if this money is channeled towards the specific project. So the role of the National Development Bank is to negotiate long-term financing, cheaper financing with the financial institutions, and to channel all this financing toward the specific projects. On the top of this, I also believe that it will be a center of technical expertise. For me, the main challenge in setting up a national development bank is not the funds, the liquidity, the money. The most challenging part is in recruiting competent people, serious people with experience in promoting development projects or projects for development. Last point, I think a national development bank would have also the role for Romania in consolidating and gathering different instruments which are currently part of them at the Ministry of Finance, others at the Ministry of Economy, others at the Ministry of Transport. The idea is to gather all the instruments which are doing today development in Romania under the same umbrella, which will provide more clarity and will provide more credentials to the Romanian state when we'll negotiate with the financial institutions.
Thank you so much. That's very clear, and it's part of the lessons we drove from those masterclasses on what leadership means. That we usually come back to the point where it's about clarity and bringing consistency and coherence around a complex issue, and that's again one of the key lessons we can draw from what you just said. The third question I wanted to ask you is the fact that surprisingly enough, Romania is one of the most independent countries among the EU from Russian gas, and that's not the result of the geography or anything. It's because you've built your infrastructure in a way that made it possible for you to be as independent as this. To what extent your development strategy also serves your sovereignty objectives? When I hear you about the development of such a national development bank and the operations you run with IFIs, you also said you wanted to develop a PPP approach, a public-private partnership approach. How much does it serve your sovereignty objectives, and how much does it make sure that Romania keeps as independent as it is now?
I think this crisis, we faced a couple of crises. We faced sanitary crisis, we faced the war, we faced which is the security crisis, we faced the inflation, we faced at the worldwide level, right? Not only in Romania. I will explain you more what I want to say. Probably now than any time, putting the national interest above everything is more than ever important, and also to promote, let's say, a more patriotic approach in terms of investments. We see that the inflation in Romania, for instance, is not due to the Romanian factors, but is more imported than generated in Romania. What I say by that, we see that the inflation is due by the disruption in the supply chain in different raw materials. We see that the inflation is due to the fact that Romanians prefer use, even though they earn better than they earned before, they prefer to spend their money on goods which are produced outside Romania. So all these factors generate inflation in Romania because we are importing all these goods at a higher price and the inflation is generated. So we see that now we have to invest in our production and in our factories in order to make Romania more independent in terms of basic goods. Romania is independent in terms of energy supply because we have heritated also a country which has a good geographical position and the investments were made. And we have also in the Black Sea, for instance, important gas reserves which are now under the plan to be invested in order to develop also the infrastructure in the energy sector.
Thanks, Mihai, for these explanations. We will elaborate upon your responses with our discussants, and I'm happy to bring into the conversation several guests. May I bring in Soichiro Chiba, who is coming from Japan. Soichiro was my fellow Y20 Summit chair. He did chair the Y20 Summit in 2019, while I chaired the Y7 Summit. Hi, Soichiro. I hope you are doing well and you can hear us correctly. Welcome into the conversation.
Hi, Thomas. I'm doing great. It's 2 a.m. in Japan. A little bit sleepy, but the conversation that you have just had
Thank you so much for catching up the conversation so late. We are also happy to bring in the conversation Dr. Raffaele della CROCE, who is a senior economist at the OECD, but he's specifically also, that's why I invited him, the co-chair of the T20 Taskforce on Infrastructures. The T20 is the Think 20, the so-called network of think tanks around the G20. And Raffaele, you did hold this position since 2021, so since the Rome summit of the G20. And this year the G20 is chaired by Indonesia, so you keep running this task force on infrastructures. I'm also happy to host Dr. Anne KRAATZ, who is an historian, and she's a senior fellow of the Open Diplomacy Institute. Welcome, Han. I do hope you can hear us also. And we were expecting my fellow Swarup Mishra from Kenya, who is a member of a global network of parliamentarians for peace, but he is committed to constitutional duties at the ask of his prime minister for now, so he could not join us as we stand, and we will miss him for the conversation. But still, we will keep going and elaborate on Mihai's answers that we just heard. And I'm encouraging everyone in the audience to use the chat and ask questions in the course of our discussion so that we can enlarge the group discussion later on. My first question would go to you, Anne. As I said, you're an historian. You've been working on the way trade with Russia was established in the 19th century. That brings us decades ago. And in the course of your research, you've outlined how much cooperation around infrastructures has been a very geopolitical issue and not just a trade issue. And now I would like you to let us understand to what extent this is geopolitical in using past examples, for example, in trade or in contemporary examples in the digital era. And if you'd like.
Thank you, Thomas. Well, I did write a book on the history of Franco-Russian trade, starting with Colbert, that is in the 17th century, up to 1900. And I have what I think is a very good example of a very geopolitical infrastructure building, and that is the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway. Not everybody knows that the Americans took a very important part in building that railway. They supplied most of the rails. And especially, they supplied all the bridges pre-mounted in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and sent them to Vladivostok, that is the endpoint of the Trans-Siberian, by boat. And this was the greatest, it was at the time called the greatest armada since the Spanish Armada of the 16th century. This is not generally taught in Russia because most Russians tend to think that the Trans-Siberian Railway was built strictly by Russians, but obviously it wasn't the case. And this was an enormous and extremely important infrastructural project, and it was obviously geopolitically very important for the Americans, especially as they were in competition at the time with the British, who'd invented a special kind of very strong steel and were very anxious to sell it to the Russians, and they did to some extent. They were also in competition with the French, but especially for locomotives. But the French did not really succeed in gaining a lot of contracts with the Russians. So that's an example of a physical infrastructure, and but at this point in time, of course, we are all concerned about the digital infrastructures, which are also, of course, physical. I mean, we can get on the internet, but not through thin air. It's either through a cable under the sea or under the earth, and we need the relays, and so all of that is physical infrastructure in order to ensure our digital connections. And so as soon as you have a digital connection, you want it to be quasi-universal, right? So if you want it quasi-universal, you try to look for a number of actors who will put it together for you so as not to make one sole actor responsible for it, because if you do have one sole actor responsible for such an important infrastructure, you run the risk, of course, of it being geopolitically used by the main provider of the physical infrastructure. So it could, in this case, Americans, French, whoever. So I would like to hear Dr. PRECUP tell us maybe what the situation of Romania's infrastructure plan in that particular field is. It seems to me that it would be interesting to hear from him what the situation is. And I would like to thank him as well for such a wonderfully clear and complete introduction to the finances of his country and the way he intends to regulate them or put them together.
Thanks, and I'm sure we will have a clear-cut answer from Mihai when we get to the to his round of discussion. But before that, I'd like to turn to Raffaele and ask you, Raffaele, I explained to our audience that you co-chair this Think 20 Taskforce on Infrastructures, and that you advise G20 countries and nations, among which we count the most important global powers today, which all use their ability to finance and build infrastructures to develop their own influence, just in the way Anne evoked what was at stake in Russia's train railway in the 19th century. How does this today influence the G20 decisions, and probably if we zoom on the US-China relationship today, how does it shape their leadership competition around the G20 table?
Thank you, Thomas, and good evening, all. Well, first of all, let me say what is G20 doing on these themes. The G20 is a consensus policy process, so the tricky moment, difficult moment we are living now is composed by 19 countries plus the Commission and development banks, which Mihai was talking about before, are sitting at the table, from the World Bank to the new Asian Infrastructure Bank that China just launched a few years ago. And the T20, like the U20, are supporting this process, giving ideas and for this transformative change that we need, including in infrastructure in our society more broadly. So the infrastructure agenda at G20 level is set by the presidency each year. And infrastructure is a new topic. I mean, not new, but it was put as a priority by Australia in 2013, and it grew in terms of importance through the years to become a geopolitical matter. Australia at the time, in 2014, put infrastructure as an asset class on the agenda. So the private sector financing, very much what Mihai was talking about. How do we channel this liquidity into bankable projects, the role of development banks, the role of institution governance, and so forth. Another key point was in 2019 when Japan put quality infrastructure on the agenda, introducing all the sustainability aspects of infrastructure linked to the ESG on the private sector side, but also on the environmental, social sustainability on more largely on the society, the SDGs agenda. Italy last year was focusing on resilience and maintenance, trying to steering away a bit from the private sector, the agenda. So very much the country in the presidency is setting the agenda. But of course, at the same time, something happened. The geopolitics changed, and the Belt and Road Initiative was launched at some point in 2013. It became visible more and more through the years. A new initiative came up, such as the gateways, EU gateways, or the Belt or the Blue Dot Initiative from the US. Very much about producing standardization products, financial instruments, which will be linked to development banks, for example, in a very competitive developing market world. And that goes with the geopolitics beyond infrastructure, with the themes that infrastructure started to tackle, including digital. That, of course, requires very much some international agreements, and for which high competition is fierce.
Thanks, Raffaele, and it's very helpful that you reminded us how the G20 works, because it's obviously one of the key objectives of such masterclasses is also to share knowledge about the working rules of the G20, which is not per se an international organization. Around the G20, as you clearly remembered, there are different engagement groups on top of the T20, among which we count the Youth 20, which I had the chance to found in France out of the French presidency of the G20 in 2011, a long time ago. And Soichiro just chaired the Youth 20 during the Japanese presidency of the G20 in 2019, as you remembered, Raffaele, working a lot on sustainability in investment in infrastructures. Soichiro, I'm curious on knowing whether within the Youth 20 you could perceive what I just pointed out as being competition between global powers around infrastructures, and especially in the Chinese approach to use infrastructure development since the Belt and Roads Initiative to enhance its influence. Was it a topic that you addressed during the Y20 summit in 2019?
Yes, Thomas. Well, it definitely was one of the topics that we addressed during the Y20 summit in 2019. Well, when you say like the Chinese in terms of infrastructure investments, we would have, maybe you're talking about the Beijing consensus and the Washington consensus, the difference between that and what kind of stakes that we have. But definitely that was the topics. That was one of the topics in the Y20 in 2019.
And how did your colleagues within the Youth 20 address this issue? Because I'm asking this because when we talk about infrastructure, as Mihai pointed out in his introductory speech, we are talking about 20, 30 years programs, meaning a generation, and precisely the role of the Youth 20 is to make a recommendation at the level of a generation and not the year to come or the 2 or 3 years to come. What type of recommendations did you put forward at the time to the Japanese presidency of the G20 in Osaka?
Yes, thank you very much. One of the recommendations was, well, so in terms of enhancing international cooperation, we need to ensure that there are going to be benefits on both sides, both in the supplier of the technology and also the receiver of the technology. And now be aware, both supplier and receiver have the responsible of making it mutually beneficial. Now for the supplier, we thought that there were three things. Number one, we need to lift up the people in the country. This includes skill sets, salary-wise, we need to lift up the people in the country to improve the standards of the people's livings. The second one is we need to create labor. We need to create jobs. So we need to ensure that the investment does create jobs in the market, thus ensuring the increase of number of workforce in the country. And the third one, we need to ensure that the country would enhance and lift up the technology level of the country. And these three things we need, as a supplier, we need to ensure, and we need to ensure that the country that we supply will not be too dependent on us. So that's the responsibility of the supplier. But on the receiver side, we also made a recommendation that they need to respect, for example, the copyright rules that the supplier is making. They should respect the rules that the supplier is, they should respect the supplier terms, like legal terms, also the ESG terms, and also the copyright rules, so that mutually the supplier and the receiver can make sure that both sides can trust each other. So that was one of the biggest recommendations that we made.
Sure, and that makes a lot of sense, and especially when we talk about, that's Raffaele who used that term, but you rephrased it, ESG criteria. Indeed, it's increasingly more important to have a clear assessment of the impact of such investments in the sustainability, with a sustainability outlook. And when we talk about sustainability, I would strongly stress the need to assess the adaptation ability of infrastructures to climate change, because investing today means having results in 10, 20 years, and in 10 or 20 years we will feel even stronger the effects of climate crisis. Well, having heard that, I'm turning back to Mihai, and in asking you this question, Mihai, as the Secretary of State for Finance in Romania, you're part of the Council of Ministers discussions, and I'm sure you've been discussing and reviewing the so-called Global Gateway project that is, in a very short and simple manner, the European response to what the Belt and Road Initiative from China has been. Meaning a major program of investment in infrastructure around the globe to develop connectivity and trade with the European Union, and level up the partnership investments with more countries. What does Romania expect from this Global Gateway program, and how do you contribute to this?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would highlight the following. In terms of geopolitics, Romania is part of the European Union, very much focused on the EU funds, absorption of EU funds, and very well used of the EU funds. We believe that we have a lot to learn and a lot to partnership with the EIB, EBRD, let's say the main arms of the European Union in terms of investments. For us, it's very important to be connected in terms of infrastructure. Either we speak about energy infrastructure, either we speak about roads infrastructure or telecom infrastructure. For us, it's very important to be connected to Western Europe. Most of our trades, like 70% of the Romanian exports, are in the European Union. So for us, it's key in order to connect from all points to the European Union. On the top of this, I would add that Romania is in very close to be accepted, or it's in a road to be accepted, very close to be accepted in OECD, which will be an official recognition for Romania that it's part of the developed countries. We used to think about Romania as an emerging country at the gate of the European Union, I believe then once we'll be part of the OECDO, this official recognition as a developed country will label us. Another point in terms of infrastructure, because we said we are very much focused in making the best use of the EU funds. We have allocated with the new plan of the European Union, National Plan of Resilience and Development in Romania. We expect to receive from the European Union almost, I would say, I think it's 20% of the Romanian GDP in terms of size, right? Lots of billions of euros in the next 5 years, and part of this will be used for the investments. I believe it's 29 billion in terms of investments, but not only infrastructure. It's a little bit broader. In order to access these funds, we are very much focused in implementing reforms, because these funds come, so it's a packet of funds and reforms. As far as you implement the reforms, you receive the funds from the European Union, which for me seems totally fair in having milestones in terms of reforms in order to access funds. So I believe that after this programming period, Romania will look totally different. We see, because I said that we are very much focused to the West, and I'm coming from the Western Romania, and I see that where the infrastructure is developed in Western Romania, also the private sector starts to develop. And we see that around the infrastructure, the private sector starts to develop companies, foreign investors relocate around that infrastructure. So we want to continue this and develop this infrastructure towards the Bucharest and center of Romania. A very important point, I think, Raffaele mentioned. For me, before having this public position, I used to work in the IFIs and also in the private sector right after that. And I think for European Union, it's very important to take into consideration the infrastructure as an asset class. Raffaele mentioned this. I think the banks in Romania and also in the European Union should consider the infrastructure as the asset class. I had numerous discussions with the banks, local banks in Romania, and trying to convince them that sometimes an infrastructure project might be more stable and can generate more predictable cash flow than a building, residential building or an office building. So I think this is very important point. We have to convince our banks that infrastructure can be a very serious and very strong asset class that it's worth looking at. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mihai. And in saying so, with the examples of the geography in Romania, you clearly remembered us how much infrastructure investment are a key enabler for growth itself, and how it is fixing growth in different territories. In having this round of discussion, I was looking forward to host our colleague from Kenya, Swarup Mishra, who is a medical doctor, and as a medical doctor, he has been elected at the Kenyan Parliament, where where he's the vice chair of the infrastructure committee, and he wanted to tell us how geopolitical this topic is when it comes to health issues. We saw it during the COVID crisis, and still today, because producing vaccines and distributing vaccines need decentralized network of health infrastructures. That's the point he wanted to make, but he is kept by constitutional duties for us, from us. So I just mentioned this issue that we discussed in our first 2022 masterclass, but we keep running with this one, and I'm turning back again to Anne to address a topic that we will probably develop in the next masterclass we have on digital disruptions. But still, in this discussion of around infrastructure, and you already touched upon this issue earlier on in saying that as of today, for example, the internet, the World Wide Web, has also physical infrastructures, which for which there is indeed a very tense global competition. And I would like you to let us know in what form this competition for the internet infrastructure takes form, and how if geopolitics about this issue would turn bad, what effects could it have on our daily lives? For example, having a not interoperable World Wide Web. What would it mean for us on a day-to-day basis?
Yes, well, this is one of the great problems of our modern society, this interoperability, which is absolutely necessary if we are to be connected to every part of the world, but which of course carries by itself this danger of the interoperability being monopolized by one or two or perhaps three of the great powers. And it is because, and also there's another aspect of it, the great sums of money that are necessary to invest in the laying down of the physical parts of this communications infrastructure, as you said, are under extreme competition, not only from the Europeans, but from the Americans as well. And a country like Romania, I wonder, will probably be approached by a number of institutions, and they will maybe vie with one another to be able to get the contract that will put Romania even more connected than it already is. Obviously, I'm thinking, for example, of the dangers of PPP, public-private partnerships, because in the public-private partnerships, I'm thinking of an American organization which is called the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, the GFC. Which has a budget of about $60 billion to invest all over the world. At this point, it's primarily probably in Africa, but perhaps in Europe as well. And of course, the idea of this financial institution is to make profit for the American citizen. This is inscribed in its charter, as it were. So you always have to be aware of the fact that PPP has great advantages, but it also has possible dangers. And in the field of communications infrastructure, even more perhaps than any other infrastructure, physical infrastructure at this point. I don't know what Dr. PRECUP thinks about that.
And especially in taking into account the externalities that that those telecommunications infrastructure do represent for the global economy, does indeed matter a lot to assess competition around those infrastructures. I'm turning back to Raffaele and to address another topical aspect of these geopolitics and what it could entail in our daily lives. We said it a bit earlier on, it's also about investing in our own ability to address the climate crisis, as infrastructure could change our carbon footprint, or depending on the type of infrastructure we do invest in, or the way we restore them, it could fix different, set different abilities to adapt to the climate crisis. I wanted to know, around the G20 table, you said that sustainability of infrastructure has been a topic since the Osaka summit in 2019, since Japan, and that resilience of infrastructure was a key topic during the Italian presidency of the G20 in 2021. So I'm asking you this question: how is this topic addressed by the G20 powers? Is it discussed in a cooperative or in a very competitive approach?
Well, Thomas, let me first say that science is clear. The climate, biodiversity, and the health crisis are interdependent. We're talking about nexus among sectors, among different policy areas. So the piecemeal approach, the silos approach won't work. We need a G20 or some sort of G20 consensus beyond the UN organization and policy processes, typically where climate issues are discussed. So we got an issue, of course, these days. How is climate discussed? Well, it depends also on the environment. I would say the geopolitics environment. We see it now. We've seen it before with the US administration when climate was not a priority on the national agenda. Then in the G20 it was difficult to discuss it. But it became mainstream since then under the major issues that I was talking about, the crisis, the low carbon infrastructure, green agenda. And in particular, this resiliency aspect of infrastructure is very much future-proofing infrastructure about climate, but also about the security, about the maintenance, focusing not just on new projects, but also on what we have, the stock of projects that are deteriorating in advanced countries were built 50 years ago, and since then have not been maintained. And how do you go about it? So that changes the focus and shifts in the climate terms the priority from the mitigation policies that you need to have to get to net zero by 2050 to adaptation, the impact that today infrastructure suffers on one hand, and the role the infrastructure has in polluting, in damaging the nature around us. And so a report was published two reports were published as an example here of work which was done by the G20. Italy mandated the World Bank and the OECD to work on two separate reports. The OECD one was on building resilience, and that supported the recommendation that went to the G20, to the finance leaders, et cetera, et cetera. And around this, there was all the process of the T20, B20, D20, U20, and so forth. So I think was a way to share ideas and converge towards where we need to go, something which is needed. Another example is going back to the finance discussion we had before, is the green finance work. And that is, again, that's an example. The working group of the G20 focusing on sustainability in finance disappeared during the US, when the US was against these themes, the US administration, and reappeared under the Italian presidency, with the decision of making China and the US as co-chairing this group, given the importance and the strength and the political clout of those powers. And of course, now is different days, but the work that has been done on building consensus around standards, around disclosure requirements, building on the Taskforce of disclosure from the FSB, is valuable work, which is driving also ESG discussion with the private sector and more broadly with the other stakeholders. So those are the concrete examples which I think are relevant. Of course, time has changed. We will not have a consensus in the G20. We're trying different forms to be seen what is going to work. Regional clubs, climate clubs at the G7 level. That is a big challenge that we have when tackling global issues these days.
Thank you so much, Raffaele. And as you said, it's also an arena issue in choosing the right forum to address these issues, which reminds us back to something that Soichiro said earlier on when he mentioned the so-called Washington consensus versus the Beijing consensus. The question I had to to square back what we were discussing was in the way the European Union has been increasingly aware of this dire need for taking care of its own strategic sovereignty, as you outlined earlier on. The level of interdependence with Russia we have now to cope with is one of the latest reminder of this issue. And I wanted to have your perspective on the way the current EU budget, including the next generation EU plan, which is the recovery plan of the EU, is in your eyes as the Secretary of State of Finance for Romania a way to take advantage of the situation and to reinforce our strategic autonomy.
Thank you very much. The next generation EU plan, as I mentioned, it's like 20 billion for Romania, which is part of it for the infrastructure and part of it for structural reforms that we have to implement. I think, as I said previously, it's the time more than never. It's like very important to focus on our national economies and develop them and try to be more independent of Russia and also from other to produce more locally, and people start to focus more and to invest more in order to be able to produce here locally. Again, thank you very much for the discussion we had. Very enriching discussion. Apologize that I have to leave. It was a great pleasure, and I really look forward to have such discussions, and always a pleasure to accept the invitation from such reputed organization. Thank you very much, Thomas.
Thank you, Mihai. We are sorry that you have to rush out. I'd like to keep running the conversation with you, Soichiro. As I said, there is a paradigm shift in which we see global competition around infrastructure building from the Washington consensus to the Beijing consensus, and I would like you to help us grasping those notions, and also having a Japanese outlook on of the regional impact it has around you from where you stand.
Sure, Thomas. So in one word, the Washington consensus is a development way. The consensus that the Americans and also the international organizations has the ideology to let the developing countries prosper by including democracy in capitalism. Now, usually there are both pros and cons of this in the world, negative opinions and positive opinions of the world. One of the disputes are, did it create income gap? Did it actually increase the economic growth of the country? Or did it actually force the ideology of democracy in the country? Now, opposed to that, the Beijing consensus is a Chinese way of imposing a development in the developing nations. And the biggest, probably the characteristic is it's imposing the Chinese way, which they do not impose the ideology of democracy, sometimes allowing a dictatorship running, but also ensuring economic growth. Now, there are, as you mentioned, Thomas, there are a couple of conflicts behind this. One is obviously ideology conflict. The question of, is it actually beneficial to all parties? Is it not exploiting? And did it actually improve the income gap? These questions are debated amongst historians and scholars around the world. But from the Japanese view, let me tell you one thing that it is on hot topic right now. We think that the lack of common rules, for example, and especially in the sustainability space between the countries that have both ideologies, is one of the hottest topics from the Japanese perspective. Questions like, what is clean? Or questions like, how do you think about transition? These things, from Japan's perspective, is very important to address. Let me give you an example. Let's say there's a petrochemical plant. A petrochemical plant's job is to import petroleum, burn it, and make a lot of petrochemical products. Throughout the procedure, there's a lot of hydrogen coming out. But whether you think this hydrogen is clean or not, maybe most of the Europeans think this is not clean. Some countries think that this is clean. Now, we need to have a clear consensus of what is clean. Otherwise, it does not enhance investments or transition finance. Another question, what is transition? Like countries like Japan, we do not have our nuclear power plant, we shut it, we lack natural resources. So if we implement the green CO2 reduction, let's say the Paris Agreement, at the same speed, at the same rate as the countries that have nuclear power plants or more natural resources, what's going to happen to our economic growth? Or what is there any subsidized scheme in that? These things are still debated and not actually fixed. So going back to your question, we think that these things should be addressed and should be accelerated in order to solve these problems.
Thanks, Soichiro. And again, I'm deeply sorry that we lost Mihai PRECUP from the conversation, but obviously we have to deal with it. And therefore, I'm taking a few questions that I saw from the audience, and the first I'd like to ask is precisely related to what you said, Soichiro. A question that I would like to ask to both you and Raffaele around sustainability. This year, during the G7 presidency hosted by Germany, the German government launched, or is about to launch actually, a G7 Climate Club, which is meant to be a pioneering group of countries who aim at accelerating as much as they can the implementation of the Paris Agreement and getting as fast as possible to carbon neutrality. And I'd like you to ask you, Soichiro, based on the Y20 experience you had, what would be the main expectations you could have for such a G7 climate group, and in general, and I'd like to ask the other question to Raffaele, when it relates to infrastructures and this topical issue we had today. What could be the deliverables that such a climate club could bring in making sure that our infrastructures are as sustainable and resilient as needed in facing the climate crisis? So first, Soichiro, and then Raffaele.
Yes, thank you, Thomas. So as the G7 is a group of 7, we share common values. I think there's a couple of things that we can do concretely in order to address the issue. And one of the problems that we seek to solve is, this relates to the previous question that you mentioned. We would like to define the definition of clean. We would like to define and enhance the rules by respecting each country's situation, because that has not been solidified yet, in order to cooperate, promote ESG growth in G7 countries. And we think that G7 is one of the very efficient platform, because it's not the group of 20, it's 7, and it's much easier to get things done. Therefore, we can go to a much detailed level. For example, what kind of technologies or what kind of transition energy that the banks globally, important banks, can make a financial transition on. So these things are what we are expecting right now.
Thanks. Raffaele, you have the other side of the question.
Yes, I would quite align with the Soichiro's comments. So the issue here is having the standards for everyone. So there is scope in these myriads of frameworks, standards around the quality infrastructure, building on the quality principle for infrastructure issued by the Japan presidency. But then how you concretely define it, very much to the point that Soichiro was mentioning. And good work has been done with taxonomy in Europe that is used as a benchmark by many countries. But still, there is a lot of work to be done, because then when you define the standards, how you do implement those at the country level, how do you make sure that the project selection is done on the basis of those principles at the strategic planning level through the process. So the G7 could actually be much more go in depth into those issues, as Soichiro said, and trying to find some agreements, at least between the major economies, on some standards, which would set a precedent. That would be the first step. The second one would be make it binding, having some legislative push and leverage to make this applicable and all the stakeholders to align on two lines, on two sides. On the public administration side, and the concrete case in Europe is the spending attached to the recovery plan, which we heard about Romania, but Italy is another one. Spain is really receiving a lot of funds from Europe, which needs to be attached to the new legislation, already using the definition of the taxonomy for sustainability issues, for environmental issues, economic sustainability, but also for social and governance one. So from that point of view, that work is happening. The other one is the private sector the definition of sustainability. Is another point of view, not necessarily the same of public sector, but at some point we need to converge, or we need to know why this is different. And I make an example, green bonds. Green bonds is an instrument through which spending attached to climate and general environmental issues is attached, public spending. And those bonds are bought by investors, the long-term patient capital that is financing part of this spending. Well, the principles attached to the green bond standards are not necessarily following the taxonomy. Are other principles which are developed well before. The investors are caught between the ESG standards on one side, the standards used on green bonds to which they're buying, and the EU taxonomy on the other side. And all these standards need to be verified. So there is reporting attached to this. So there is quite an industry, quite a number of different parties involved, not necessarily talking to each other. And that is happening as we speak. So that is an example of where, when we say convergence, that needs to happen soon, because otherwise we will find ourselves going different directions.
Yeah, and you wanted to add anything to this one? I saw
I really wanted to ask a question. I hear words like convergence. We must agree on the definition of clean, and this is absolutely indispensable. I'm convinced of that. But at the same time, I'm always concerned about the diversity that we need, as we need diversity in nature, in the plant world, in the animal world, etc. We also need diversity in the implementation of these grand projects that affect everybody's daily lives. And it is quite clear to me that there is a need for not only, of course, taking into consideration every country or every group of persons, different ideas about essential questions such as the notion of clean, in this case, clean air, but it also seems to me that we are putting too much emphasis, especially as far as getting the public to adhere to these big infrastructure projects, which I repeat are essential. But we must present those projects as not necessarily a group adherence to a concept, but a concept that is taking into account all the various attitudes and cultural references that are involved in laying out those structures, and that will affect the cultural references that people have. And I think that's one of the major, and I'm actually asking the question, I think that is something that is not often enough taking into account. I mean, the Dr. Paciuc from Romania insisted that when they put together the National Development Bank, they want to have a local footprint. They want to have a sound project, of course, but they want a local footprint. And of course, the difficulty these days is, especially with the PPP approach to all these very expensive developments, of infrastructure developments, is that it takes care of financial interests, it takes care of maybe some efficiency interests, and it takes care of the paramount interest, which is that it should be interoperable, but it leaves behind quite a few and very important in the end aspects that, for lack of a better word, for lack of a better concept, I will call cultural concepts. And I'm just putting this question to...
Yeah, and building on your remark and questions, I'd like to ask this question to both Soichiro and Raffaele. We talked about the ESG dimensions of investment, and in sustainability aspects, there is indeed the social and cultural dimensions that remain very important. And I guess that's another way of phrasing what Anne just pointed out. Do you feel like this social and cultural dimensions of investment in infrastructures is enough taken into account in the clarification processes we are entering in? So Ichiro, you mentioned the need for clarification of notions like clean energy or clean industry. Do you think like culture and social aspects are cared enough in investments? And same, and more specifically for Raffaele, in recommendations that the T20 is providing to the G20 group, this dimension of social and cultural care in infrastructure building is taken into account, or is it beyond the scope of your job on a day-to-day basis? First Soichiro and then Raffaele.
Yes, thank you very much, Anne. I think that's an extremely important point. When I say we need to implement a common rule or a common standard, I do not say that we have one set rule that apply for every single country. My point was to have a rule that respects each other countries' customs and situations, so that each country can go work on based on that rule to a common goal. That was my point. I just wanted to clarify. Obviously, each country's situation is extremely different. Japan's situation is different from France, and if we have the same common rule, there's going to be a disparity in some way. Some party is going to lose, some party is going to benefit. So I think you're totally right in terms of respecting each country's situations and having a rule based on that, and then sharing that to each other countries and agreeing on that is extremely important. But one question, so in terms of, if you say cultural differences and social differences, it's quite hard for me to imagine in terms of investment, respecting those things on investment projects. Are you saying that, respecting each country's situations like energy sources and stuff is important, or are you talking completely more about like the social and cultural dimensions? I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
I'm thinking in terms of social and cultural differences, and I don't mean there could be many different social and cultural differences within one country. So it's a very big subject. All I'm trying to say is that it's actually what I'm trying to say is that these projects, which are necessary, we have to have interoperability. That is not the question. Otherwise, the systems, the big infrastructure systems won't work. We see it today with the different spaces between the rails in Russia and in Europe. But it also has to be sold to the public. This is something that is very important to the European Union, to the cohesion of the European Union, which is the most diverse, it could be argued, group of people in the world today. And so I think this aspect has to be taken into account. The aspect that we have to quote unquote sell it to the public that is going to be using those infrastructures, that somehow or other they have been their particularities have been involved in the project. I'm thinking of Japan going into India in a big way. They have started a number of very interesting and important infrastructure projects in India. Well, to make it a little bit, be the devil advocate, I suggest that the definition of clean in Japan is not the same as the definition of clean in India. You see what I mean? So, but I'm not.
Maybe I can respond a bit to one point, because I think it's respond to an approach which we've been proposing, which is about nature-based solution. So working with nature rather than against nature. And that means specific projects such as green corridors along railways, or to make animals cross different parts of the territory. It means green roofs. It means wetlands or mangroves to avoid inundation, coastal flooding. More broadly, this implies a new approach, an ecosystem approach, where you're looking to the set of climate issues, mitigation, adaptation, biodiversity, environmental sustainability, pollution, and so forth, but also social dimension, putting human back at the center with nature. If you think about this in a urban context, when you think about a green area, focusing on a green area in a urban context, we're not just talking about the green element, which per se is a small part of the project. We're talking about planning, sustainable planning, how the green will interact, how the rail station will interact with the green park, how the mobility bicycles will be around, how they're going to move, how the social interaction among people will be. And especially in peripheries of countries, that is an even more important value. And that is the new way of thinking about infrastructure development, which is social development effectively. The infrastructure thinking about the nature connections rather than the physical ones. And how the synergies, if we need to build, because that could be maybe not even necessary. If we need to build, how they do go together? How do we make in a social context?
Thanks, Raffaele, for this answer. In your first answer, you said that one role that one could expect from the G7 Climate Club is to set standards and pioneering. And you, Raffaele, you even spoke about binding commitments. At the end of the day, even though the G7 group is a like-minded group, very efficient in leading and setting the agenda, it is not meant to set any standard or even principles. It's only setting the agenda, which brings me to another G group that is at the heart of our reflection, the G20 that we've been talking already about. And I wanted to ask the three of you, starting with Anne, then to Raffaele, and then to Soichiro, about this question. Because of the war that Russia has launched against Ukraine, the G20 group is even more polarized than it was over the past few years. And we've seen the US president advocating a lot about the idea of removing Russia from the club, just like it was removed from the G8 club, which turned back to be the G7 in 2014 after Russia invaded Ukraine and Donbass. And I wanted to ask you whether you believe this is a relevant stance from the US, or whether the consequences on global governments that it would entail would be too hazardous to make it relevant in 2022, while we need the G20 leadership to address the climate crisis and all other economical issues we've been discussing throughout this conversation. First Anne, then Raffaele, and then Soichiro.
Well, of course, the war has upended the whole question of climate change and climate control, and because it's obviously going to increase pollution in military conflict, always does. increases pollution tremendously. It has also forced us to reconsider what to do with the biggest country in the world, which is Russia, the largest country in the world. And we build interoperable structures that would cover the entire world. No longer in a way, because we cannot. The finance minister of Romania was talking about one of the important elements of the development of infrastructure, and that is stability. So we are in a state of flux at this point. So it is, I would think it is at this point in time, it is a little bit more difficult than it was 3 months ago before the war to envisage very grand infrastructure development projects if we want those infrastructure projects to be interoperable, which we do in most cases. So this is, at this point, the question cannot yet be answered because Europe is at war. I mean, Ukraine is at war with Russia, and Russia happens to be the biggest country in the world. And so it had, originally, it was figuring to some extent into our plans of worldwide development. And it can no longer do that at this point anyway. So I don't know what the future will bring. I have no idea.
And specifically on the stance of the US president to remove the Russian membership from the G20, what do you think? Do you think in this case where we all seek for global cooperation, it would make sense to break out the one only group merging, combining the emerging economic powers with industrialized nations? Do you think it's a good idea from Biden to ask Putin to leave the G20 group, or do you think it's a wrong way approach of resolving next crisis?
This is too political a question to be able to be answered because the American inner politics are playing a very big role in making those decisions on the part of Americans. And if you ask my personal feeling, I always find it hard, of course, to understand how we could ever cast aside forever, or at least for a long time, the largest country in the world, which I repeat is Russia. But at the same time, it cannot go on sitting with us and participating in all of those discussions as if nothing had happened. So I'm sorry I cannot be categorical, but in the best of all possible worlds, the war would stop. There might be a regime change in Russia, and then we would certainly all, I suppose, welcome Russia back into the fold. But yeah. I have no idea. And certainly the American government...
Looking back in what happened after the Russian government invaded Ukraine in Crimea and Donbass, Russia was removed from the G7 group, from the G8 group, which turned back to be the G7. Raffaele, you probably were already involved in these governance processes at the time, and I've seen the effects on the working of the G20. How do you think it could? Do you think it would make sense to keep such a stance, and what would be the drawbacks and probably the aftermath effects of such a political disrupting decision if it would happen at some point within the period of the Indonesian presidency of the G20?
Well, let me say that as Azan was saying, that's too many uncertainties there. I can give my opinion. It's a personal opinion. Of course, it's what I can say is that the US unilaterally stepping out from the G20 doesn't mean necessarily that all the other countries would follow. Think about China and think about other developing countries, not necessarily align with the US and with Europe. If it was to be US and Europe, Japan, we would go back to the G7 somehow. And this idea of the club enlarging the G7 to the willing countries, which probably may be a direction where we're going to go. But that, of course, depends on the war and all these unpredictable events which could happen in the next weeks. For sure, we're stuck at the moment in the G20. It's quite difficult from a practical point of view to bring forward work. So I don't see this staying this way for long from a governance point of view.
So at this stage, stuck or disrupted, to unviable options. I'm turning lastly to you, Soichiro, because from a purely international point of view, Japan is still at war with Russia since the early 20th century. Well, you've bound other type of connections with Russia in between. But how is this idea of President Biden perceived in Japan? Does it make sense? And how do you think, if we step aside from geopolitics and politics at all, from your perspective as the US-20 leader from the Japanese presidency in 2019, how would you perceive such a decision, such a disruption of the G20 group?
Thomas, this is a very difficult question. But so I can speak for what's the public view of the Japanese public view for Biden administration. It's more about, so I understand in the world there's different opinions about the Biden administration and their sanctions to Russia, but in Japan it's pretty much positive. I would say about 70 to more than 80%. If you take a poll, I didn't see the poll, but I think it's more positive. Because of just the fact that Russia is invading the Ukraine. But there are some other opinions in Japanese public that, well, they also blame some other parties of making, there's a very complicated history of why this happened. So that's the public opinion of Japan regarding the issue of Russia. Now, how I see this is very difficult, but I can say two things. Number one, is the sanction effective from who? Maybe from the US perspective of view, it's more effective than not doing a sanction because you need to increase the level of pressure or punishment to prevent other military actions. But I'm worried about two things. Number one, is it really effective? Because there are other countries that are subsidizing the loss that Russia made by being imposed sanctions from the Western countries. And number two, even if it's extremely successful, would such isolation result in some more disastrous outcome, such as the nuclear war? So these things I'm extremely worried about. So given that these two worries and also the divergence of the opinions, the world, I will say my opinion is pretty much mixed. I do not have a definite solution or definite standpoint that I can take like most of the Japanese people are taking right now. That will be my answer to you.
Thanks, Soichiro. And I would wrap it up like this, is that not being conclusive, it's sometimes the best way to be a leader in times of ambiguity and in times of very fluid balances of power. Well, I would like to thank the three of you for having been with us the whole way through. We need to also thank very much Mihai PRECUP, Romanian Secretary of State for Finance, for having been with us today to discuss this very technical and political issue of the way infrastructures build interdependencies between nations and thus play a specific role in geopolitics. That was a very hard issue to explore, and I would like to warmly thank those who asked their questions and those who tackled the difficult questions we had. I give you I tell you that the next masterclass we will have is about facing digital disruptions. That's going to take place on the 14th of June, same hours. with another bunch of leaders that we will bring together around the same table. Let's meet there, because there will be a continuity with our discussions, especially when it comes down to internet governance, which is part of the topic of the topics we discussed today. Thank you so much, Soichiro, Anne, and Raffaele, for being with us. Thanks to our audience, and we will meet in 2 weeks. Goodbye.